Welcome.
That would be a fabulous check-in question is what's in your UU go bag? A chalice, a lighter, a candle.
Yeah, I would also totally bring like a little blanket altar thing. Yeah. Yeah. a reading book.
Reading.
I might just keep that in. For introduction. Welcome to the podcast, Winding the Circle Sacred Story. So I'm your host, Sky Williams Tao, and I use they, them pronouns.
And I'm Jamili Omar. I use she, her pronouns.
And I will say right here, I just was ordained, so I'm actually a Reverend Sky Williams Tao.
Sky! Woo!
This is the first time we're recording after my ordination, so had to throw that in there. But in this episode, which is our 10th episode, we're discussing the Congregations and Communities chapter of Widening the Circle. And for this chapter, we will be centering the question, what conflict do we need? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but first, we'll do a grounding exercise. So thinking about grounding yourself into the floor, think about opening yourself up to the sky, and think about all the places in between, and strengthening your core to hold both places together. Maybe take a breath in and out. And I'll read our opening while Jamili lights her chalice. We return to love again and again and again. We value what is true. We honor holiness. We try and we grow, and we fail and we rest and we try. We are here together now. We need one another. We covenant.
So Sky, you wrote our question for today. What's the origin of that question?
Yeah. So part of the origin is that I was leafing through my copy of Widening the Circle, and mine is totally marked up. I early on made a decision to just like have a set of colorful pencils nearby me when I was reading. And so it's like all marked up with colorful things. But one underline that stuck out to me that I'd done before was on page 51. And it's in the recommendations for this chapter. One of the actions is to equip leadership development efforts at the associational or regional level with information on how to facilitate needed conflict and how to promote racial equity. Which led to this longer sort of thing in my brain about thinking about what conflict we need in our congregations that I think this chapter is highlighting around things like pushing us to change from being a social club to being more theologically centered, and that knowing that like that sort of change can often come from discomfort and uncomfortable conversations, which can lead to conflict, or have people like sort of bring up some of these ways in which people in our congregation are different or have different ideas, which again can be a space of conflict. And the question, I think, what conflict do we need, holding that idea that some conflict is actually really good and helps us explore those differences between us in ways that are productive and in ways that help all of us to grow. And at the same time, I think there's conflict that is not helpful. Like I was thinking, we talked to Reverend Sarah a little bit ago, and she was sort of talking about these fights around, is the eighth principle too wordy? And that comes up to me as a conflict that's just not helpful. Particularly, I think just, is the eighth principle too wordy is not a particularly generative or useful question to me. And I think and there can actually be an interesting or a more essential conflict that I think that is hiding that is the question of, is anti-racism work theologically grounded?
Mm-hmm.
And that actually, I mean, I think is, can be a useful conflict for our congregations when maybe the dominant assumption in our congregation is that it's not, or maybe that it is, but people are resisting that.
Mm-hmm.
So to have that sort of submerged conflict be out
Mm-hmm.
in the open, or to be openly discussed and really be like really have that real conversation as a congregation, like, do people think that's essential for Unitarian Universalism, can actually be a helpful thing to do that, you know, really important discernment in this time together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where that question came out of for me for this chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to invite the congregations to discern, like you said, what the root of the conflict is, and the root where it comes from, and what's needed conflict and what's not needed conflict. That change will always be conflictual. And something in what you said kind of highlights for me the idea that we need to lead ourselves into this conflict so that we can become the organization that we aspire to and that we say that we are. And that is really important, that it's not going to come out of a place of comfort. That's going to come out of a place of change, which is going to be out of conflict.
Yeah, and I think this idea that sometimes, I mean, people talk about this, I think, in peace studies, but this idea that, like, I'm thinking of, like, my brain went to like peace and then like null peace, but like, I don't know if that was the term, but like this idea that sometimes not having open conflict doesn't mean that conflict doesn't exist. It means that it's going on in weird ways at the fringes of things, or that there's underlying tensions that people just aren't addressing. And I don't think you need to address every tension. Like, communities have different tensions, but you know, I think that it speaks to me of this like way in which, like, it can actually help us be more honest about ourselves, to open up some of the important things happening.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really this idea of conflict, and the ideas in this chapter are really tied up though in fear and what people are losing. That the chapter throws out the term, we need to move away from a social club to becoming a religious organization, almost glibly. And I worry that that's a moment, or that's a place of tension where people can say, but wait a minute, we're not a social club. We do wonderful things. We do social justice. We do all of this. It feeds me, you know, in my life, and it's been with me for years. And I'm afraid that if it changes too much, I won't actually be welcome here. And that is a real fear that keeps us trapped. And by not acknowledging, by not saying those fears out loud, then I'm thinking about Bowen family systems, right? Where we triangulate, it's not this fear, it's this other thing. And then we make this conflict in the system that really isn't about that, but it's my fear of losing my religious home because it's going to look different or sound different or be different than when I came into it.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that comes up hearing you say that for me is just like, in part, is the pastoral response of just like, you know, like, I mean, I think we all understand that fear, you know, like, I mean, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about hospitality and welcome, but like, we also need to talk about folks who are already losing their religious homes, or don't even get a chance to sort of have one. The other thing that it comes up for me is actually the first sentence of this chapter, that many of our congregations are in trouble, is the first phrase, with dwindling membership, participation, and financial contributions. Which is to say,
what's interesting about the rest of that paragraph is we start this section with two assertions. First, that real-time face-to-face congregations matter, even with all the challenges to maintain them, and in a time when church-going is less valued. And second, we will also need to support alternative and often virtual communities in order to ensure the survival of communal associations, especially for younger UUs of color and those living in areas where less mainstream identities are less common. I mean, it's really a complicated first paragraph.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, I brought it up just to say that, we talked about this in the trends section, but one thing that I hold just in my own, like religious professionalism or whatever, is that things are changing. Like we actually don't get to decide whether our congregations are going to change. Like at this point, like things are changing. We get to decide how. We get to control, to a certain extent, how our congregations change. Yeah. And we get to control, I think, a little bit whether they die or whether they evolve. And not to I don't think it's quite that stark, and this is going to be a much longer process, but like just there are trends and there are things that speak to how things are changing already. Yeah, and then which I think actually kind of leads us into what you were talking about with this, the second part of the paragraph around virtual and real time. And so I'd love for you to say more words about that.
Well, I think it's complicated because we know that the worship portion anyways, if we take worship out of all of the things that go around, the hug around worship, right? Saturday to Saturday, or Monday to Saturday, the stuff around worship. If we just take worship out, we know that there are communities that can access online worship easier. And because they're not walking into situations of unwelcome, diswelcome, reverse of welcome, and microaggressions and outright aggressions and this conflict, are more willing and able to be in community with us because all of that stuff around worship of interacting and socializing isn't fraught online. They're in their space, they're in their safe space. And they have that I think what complicates that is access, right? When we're talking about folks that are under-resourced, whether transportation or financially might not have access to the internet to watch worship. We're talking about another whole subset of folks that aren't able to access Unitarian Universalism. And so how do we work for them? One of the things I thought was really significant in this chapter was the testimony by the person who came from a working class background and the values conflict between them as working class and the orientation of the system to middle class or wealth. And I thought that was really significant in this chapter.
Yeah, let me know if you
find it, of course.
Yeah. I will say throughout the chapter, I also stood out to me, there was one that was a testimonial from African American woman who was really like explicitly laying out some of the microaggressions and aggressions she had experienced. That one stuck out to me as also being like a really just clear picture of what somebody could experience. And what somebody has, right? I mean, this is, I'm sure from somebody's history and story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the testimony on page 46, a submitted testimony at the very end says, it seems to me there's a disconnect there, and there might be a way of expressing that disconnect, and therefore the struggle. So that's easier for somebody to say, yeah, I want to diversify as long as I don't actually do anything or change myself, as long as the congregation doesn't have to change. And I suspect that's kind of a struggle a lot of people are going through. So we want diversity as long as I don't have to experience it.
Yeah, I underlined that. that was, I want it as long as I don't have to change myself, or as long as the congregation doesn't have to change. And it's interesting they talked about, like the sort of preceding story was about how the church was showing interest around the concept of diversity, but not the concept of like anti-racism work or anti-white supremacy work. The person wasn't sure exactly what the topic had been, but which I also think, I'm thinking about the sort of question of conflict and like just to speak, like there can also be conflict within ourselves. around, like you named, like fear, right? And that can totally be we can feel fear and like hope and like trepidation around, you know, being asked to do something we're uncertain of, and like, you know, like a desire, like curiosity to figure out like what exactly are these people saying? I don't totally get it, right? And can feel those things, you know, and potentially care or sorrow or grief around, like care for, you know, like ourselves or a friend who's bringing up things, and like grief around things that have happened, or like the history that we share, right? I mean, and like I just think that, like, to name that, we can absolutely have a whole lot of different feelings happening inside ourselves that can potentially be in conflict.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to point us to in the chapter is that this is, so far in going through this text again, this chapter has the most concrete examples and verbiage in it. And I want us to start by talking about the, I think it was on page 40 in the printed text, congregational polity, because I think that's a very concrete thing that we often get confused on. So what was the message about polity you were pulling out of this section by Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore?
Yeah, I think it was this, so one thing I think was this shift from that I'm seeing, not just like, I think her work is sort of interacting with, has helped to spark, and is also, I think, you know, sort of in response to, like, I think there's a broader shift around moving towards greater collaboration amongst congregations. And so that's a piece, and I want to talk more about that. And where my eye's falling, like where I'm seeing right now, is also this piece about democracy, because I know we've had a conversation about democracy before on this, you know, podcast video series. But her quote really stuck out to me as like, this is on page 40, the first little bit, but, and while Unitarian Universalists value democracy, it is best not seen as democracy in the purely political sense. This is not about winning by vote alone, but rather as honoring voices of all and listening to the call of conscience. So thinking about that, I don't know, like, it's something that struck me about that being, you know, not just one person, one vote, or one person, one voice almost, but really being much more attentive to the community as a whole, and whose voices are being represented and whose aren't, and also like what the call of conscience is, right? I mean, I think that's also sometimes expressed as what our mission is, or what our calling is, right? Like that piece. And I know and I feel like that's such a small piece of what she's saying. So also, like, I don't know if you want to talk more about the sort of piece I started with about this collaboration.
Well, the collaboration, and the way she points me to that is, and I honestly, I have a soapbox about this, is Frederick Muir's iChurch. I'm sure I've said this in this podcast before, but she's really talking about the power of the individual of our congregational and covenant community is best held with humility. Right? So she's really pointing us towards this, away from I church. Church is about me, to we church, that we are together are the church, and we are the body of it, and responsible for each other and to each other, which she says very well. And then later in the chapter, on page 46, big bold letters, it says, Unitarian Universalist Association member congregations must act both as independent bodies and in coordination, covenant and communion with other congregations. So we're acting not as lone. This document challenges us to de-atomize, ATOM, right? To come back together from the individual to the community, from the community, so single congregation or church, to the association, to those in both physical proximity and relational proximity to us. So she's taking us from this, I'm an individual and this is my church, to we are a group and this is our church, this is our association. And to me, that's empowering. To me, that says you have compatriots at your back. You know, you have a support system that's broader. I think and you can speak to this better than I can, but our youth and young adults, this is what they talk about when they go to conferences, is I saw myself as a part of a movement, of an organization. I felt myself as a part of a whole that they were able to see when they went to these churches. And young adults have told me that as a youth, they can go to any UU congregation and feel at home because this is their faith. And isn't that a beautiful vision of who we are and what we want to be? Is that sense of belonging to each other?
Yeah, so it makes me think of a story, which also leads me to, I think, the other piece I wanted to explore in here, which I think is related, but this, like, I remember the first time I went to General Assembly. And I know, like, this chapter actually talks about some of the problems with General Assembly and access, and particularly, I think, economically, but also in other ways. But this sense of being with so many other Unitarian Universalists, like just the idea that there were this many Unitarian Universalists in the world, like, because, you know, I mean, because a lot of my experience growing up, and I think this is a West Coast thing, I think more than an East Coast thing, but nobody knows what Unitarian Universalism is. Like, you say that and nobody knows what that is. And so just to, like, have this, you know, huge amount of people be Unitarian Universalists. And I think, you know, like, I'm also thinking about, like, Youth Caucus, around what you're saying, around, like, has a really strong, I think, sense of, or at least in my experience, of speaking as a caucus, right? And actually the real power that can come from the Youth Caucus speaking as a whole caucus. Yeah, I mean, I think so, which also brought up in my brain a piece of this that's on page 41, but of this polity that Reverend Dr. Fenimore quotes Conrad Wright, and who has this quote about the UUA and how people sort of, we call it the Unitarian Universal Association. Sometimes, perhaps, when we are tired and exasperated, we think of it as a distant bureaucracy and berate it as though it was something alien that has somehow been saddled on us. Sometimes, in a more reasonable mood, we recognize that it is there to serve us, not merely with things like hymn books and religious education materials, but also with established and responsible agencies. For this very same consultation among churches, the Cambridge Platform insisted was a necessary aspect of the Fellowship of Churches. But the UUA is something more than an agency to serve us. It is, in some respects, it actually is ourselves, and provides an organ through which we may state from time to time the consensus that prevails among us, so that the waywardness of particular churches may, if necessary, be revoked, although not coerced by the opinion of the whole. Which I just think speaks to, I mean, I think in what you were saying, right, that I think there is a difference, and I think this exists in different ways for people, about whether you think you are a member of a church or a member of a religious movement.
That's really good. Say that again.
Oh, just like I think there is a difference between whether you think you are a member of a church or a member of a religious movement.
How would you behave if you felt that you were a member of a religious movement? Not the general you. How do people behave?
I mean, I was actually going more personal. But just like, I think about, like, you know, like, to me, some of these trends around religion are something I pay more attention to, I think, like, you know, I mean, because it's not just a question of whether a sort of particular church dies, although I think there can be, like, not to say there's not real grief around that, but like that, you know, that there is this sort of bigger thing to be attentive to. And also, actually, what you said, right? I mean, like, you know, I grew up in a church, and then I went to a church that was near my college, and then I moved to Chicago, went to a church there, and then, I mean, at that point, you know, I was in ministry track, so then I moved to Syracuse and went to, and was part of a church there, and now I moved back home, right? I mean, like, there's a way in which I I mean, each church is different, and I like that's, you know, I think like you find home in different ways, I think, but that like the sense that there's something bigger, which also I know we have other like, okay, it also makes me think of something you brought up much earlier, but this idea of like in-person churches and virtual, and this idea that like, I think if we think of ourselves as a religious movement, like it's sort of all a piece of that. Like it's all like, there's a lot, I believe there's a lot of ways to do things like faith development. There's a lot of ways to do things like worship. Actually, I feel like we're really, this is a soapbox now, but like we're actually really limited in the way we perceive worship. Like you know, like an hour service with a 20-minute sermon or a 15-minute sermon, like 3 hymns, and like, you know, like that's really all. It's like, it's one way of doing worship, and it is a beautiful way of doing worship, but it really is only one way of doing it. There's a lot of other ways, and so like that's what I think of when I think of, you know, this in-person virtual. Like, you know, I think like there's a lot of actually virtual spaces that are real and meaningful spaces, and there are that provide, that are like different, like are different, but that doesn't, you know, like in like different from in person, and there's like different ways you can do in person. Like my brain is like it's like gender, where like as I understand gender stuff, it's not that we want, you know, like there to be no gender or like to erase genders. We want there to be like a plethora, a rainbow, like a bunch of million billion genders, right? So there's a lot of like, there's a sort of fullness and like cornucopia of things you can do.
And that's what part of what this chapter brings out is, when we're thinking about the longevity of this faith movement and of our individual congregations, our younger adults, take that how you will, younger adults expect more. They expect a congregation that embraces those fullnesses, not just of race, gender, et cetera, but also fullness of worship. And so how can we bring worship to a different place that meets those expectations and those real needs for community and for worship and spiritual development, for religious education, because they expect it. And I don't think it's unrealistic. I feel like we should be able to do it. We have a fullness in this faith tradition. We should be able to expect. I was thinking too about the idea of covenanting. That's really at the end of the chapter. And maybe this is a point I've already made, but it's in big bold again on page 48. They say congregations lack a covenantal understanding with one another and with the association, which is critical to the effectiveness of congregational polity. And I think we've talked about that before, that our covenants, our agreements with each other are not that we will be the same, but that we will be in relationship with each other and respect the differences between our congregations. I think that ties into what you were talking about, that every church you've been at had a different flavor, and they're all in covenant with each other, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and sorry, it brings me back to the question of like that conflict, right? Again, like this negotiating difference, and like I think, you know, like I think like not that difference always breeds conflict. Like I don't mean to be saying that, but that like I do believe that conflict arises out of our differences, and that's actually a really valuable place to learn. Yeah, and like the, you know, like that some like recognizing where in covenant, I mean, and that just being actually a really important part of relationship or covenant, right? Is like negotiating when is conflict speaking to something deeper that we actually need to address. When is it, you know, like sort of speaking to differences between us that are sort of like, okay, we just need to respect you're different than me, and I don't get why you want to do that, but like I just respect that we're different in that way. And when does it speak to like, oh no, there's actually a danger here, right? Like you're noticing your neighbor is, you know, like not doing the diversity work, or like the, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion work they really need to be doing, or are terrible to their religious professionals, right? Like when is there some conflict that needs to come out to help protect people?
Yeah. And doing the inner conflict of the change that's required, the change that's going to be required to change our congregations. And that's very much conflict. Yeah. I'm formulating an idea that I don't know that is very well put together yet, but there's a way in which the congregations can and should lean into supporting its members in those changes, and there's ways in which it's on the individual to make the change, right, to accept that. And again, thinking about the parts and the whole is, how do we do that? How do the congregations offer that support for members who are really feeling conflicted about these changes, and not causing more harm to others in the process? I don't know. Is there anything you want to add? I'm going to wrap us up and take us to our actions.
So the thing that's in my brain right now is just this piece that actually Karen talked about when we talked about trends. So this thing about how we've actually already been doing this work for a long time. I think speaking to some of sort of anti-racism, anti-oppression work. And I think I just wanted to lift up that some of the relational work that I think is key to some of this, we actually have an incredibly solid theological foundation around covenant, right? And we actually have, I'm not sure we always have great practices around it, or we are totally developed in that theology, but I actually think we have a really solid theology around which to speak about our relationships as individuals within a congregation, between congregations, and as a whole association.
Good. Well, our action, I want to invite people to lean into those covenants because as we close out today, I want to invite or challenge everybody to, in my printed copy, it's on page 47. There's actually a call out box called Recommended Congregational Practices to Increase Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity. And they're not panacea. They're not a magic pill that's going to make everything all right and better. But I do think they're really wonderful places to begin, especially at the congregational level. And they're things that anybody in a congregation or a fellowship or a community at all can bring forward and propose to the board or to the leadership and say, hey, how about we do this one thing? It doesn't have to be the biggest thing, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Just to take the first movement forward and making some of these come to fruition. So there's a whole list. There's 6 things on there. I'm sure people can think of other action steps to take, but the goal is an action, something that we do to move us forward, and not just talking about it, but actually doing something. Anything else you want to add, Skye? Reverend Skye?
No. Is there anything else you want to add? I feel like you always ask me this question.
No, I feel complete. Yeah. And I wish everybody to go in peace, go in power, go do good in the world, and go knowing that you are truly deeply loved.
At the end of the podcast, we'd like to say a few thank yous. Thank you to Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona, or UU Jazz, especially to Janine Gelsinger and Phoebe Dubich. And thank you all for being with us. Remember that you can contact us at uusacredstory@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.